I had the blade at my neck, and I was ready to die for a god I didn't know until the man in white appeared. The steel was cold, smelling of oil and old blood. I could feel the grit of the Afghan dust between my skin and the edge of the sword. For years, I was the one holding the blade. I was the one deciding who lived and who died in the name of a holy war I thought would buy me a place in paradise. But as I knelt there in the dirt of a courtyard I once commanded, I realized that all my prayers, all my fasting, and all the blood I had shed had left me completely empty. I was a commander of men, but a slave to fear. My name is Zabila Mansour. I am 38 years old. Not long ago, I was a district commander for the Taliban in the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan. I was raised in the madrasas, fed a diet of fire and brimstone from the time I could walk. My childhood wasn't filled with toys or laughter. It was filled with the rhythmic chanting of verses I didn't fully understand and the heavy weight of expectations. I was groomed to be a lion for Islam, a guardian of a faith that demanded everything and promised only a distant, terrifying judgment. By the time I reached my 30s, I had reached the pinnacle of what my society valued. I had power. I had soldiers who moved at my word. I had a family that feared and respected me. But inside, there was a void so deep that no amount of religious zeal could fill it. I felt like a man walking through a desert with a mouthful of salt. The more pious I became, the thirstier my soul felt. Then came the betrayal. In our world, power is a shadow that shifts with the sun. And my own men I had bled with, turned on me. They accused me of treason, of being soft, of secret dealings. It was a lie, but in the mountains, a lie told by the powerful is the only truth that matters. They stripped me of my black turban, they beat the dignity out of my bones, and they forced me to my knees. As the executioner stepped behind me, I closed my eyes. I didn't pray to Allah. For the first time in my life, I stayed silent. I thought, if this is the end of a faithful life, then why is my heart so full of terror? Before I tell you how that executioner's hand froze and how my life was shattered and rebuilt by a love I didn't think existed, I want to ask you something. Please, if you are searching for truth, or if you feel like you are in a darkness that will never end, subscribe to this channel and like this video. Comment below if you need prayer. Share this story, because someone out there, maybe someone just like the man I used to be, needs to know that no one is too lost for grace. No one is too far gone for the King of Kings. I stood at the precipice of eternity, looking into a dark canyon with no bridge. My status as a commander meant nothing. My knowledge of the law meant nothing. The dust in the air seemed to choke the very soul out of me before the blade even touched my skin. I wondered if my ancestors were watching, if they too had felt this hollow coldness at the end of their struggle. I had spent a lifetime building a fortress of rules, only to find that I was the prisoner inside it. The shadows of the mountains seemed to lean in, eager to swallow the memory of a man who had lived for a shadow. My hands were tied behind my back, the rough hemp biting into my wrists, a physical reminder of the spiritual bondage I had inhabited for nearly 4 decades. Every breath felt like a stolen mercy, a countdown to a silence I dreaded more than the pain. I looked at the dirt, seeing the tiny insects crawling through the grit, and envied their simple existence. They did not have to worry about the judgment of a distant angry sky. They did not have to wonder if their blood would be enough to satisfy a debt that felt infinite. I was a man of the mountains, a man of iron, yet in that moment I was nothing more than a whisper of smoke in a gale. The silence of the courtyard was deafening, broken only by the rasp of the executioner's breath and the distant cry of a hawk. I was ready to disappear. I was ready to be forgotten. But the universe, it seemed, he had a different plan for the commander who had lost his way. To understand why my execution felt like a mercy, you have to understand the cage I lived in. It wasn't a cage of bars. It was a cage of perfection. In the eyes of my village and my fighters, I was the model of an Islamic leader. I had 4 wives, as permitted. I had sons who were being trained in the same madrasas that shaped me. My home was a fortress of Sharia. We didn't listen to music. We listened to the wind and the recitation of the Quran. We didn't watch movies. We watched the horizon for enemies. I remember the prestige. Walking through the market, men would stop and bow their heads. Commander Zabiullah, they would whisper with a mix of awe and terror. I enjoyed it for a while. It felt like the blessing of God. Yeah, but the internal rot began when I started seeing the faces of the people we were saving. I remember a specific afternoon in a small village near the border. We had received word that a family was wavering in their loyalty. I led the raid myself. We dragged a young man into the street, accusing him of possessing forbidden materials. His mother, a woman with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that had seen too many wars, threw herself at my boots. "Commander, please," she wailed, her voice cracking the dry air. "He is my only son. He is a good boy. Have mercy for the sake of the compassionate." I looked down at her. I had the Quranic verses of war memorized, but at that moment her cry for mercy hit a wall in my chest. If God was truly the most merciful, why was my job always to be the hand of punishment? I felt a flash of irritation, not at her, but at the system. I pushed her away with my boot and ordered the boy to be taken. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my prayer mat, going through the motions of the salat. My forehead touched the ground, but my mind was in that dusty street. I began to realize that my piety was actually a performance. I was a hollow shell of a man. I followed every rule, I enforced every law, yet I had no peace. I looked at my wives and felt no deep connection, only the burden of being their master. I looked at my sons and felt fear that they would become exactly like me. I started searching the text for something, anything, that spoke of a personal relationship with the divine. I found laws, I found punishments, I found a God who was always a billion miles away, waiting for me to trip so he could cast me into the fire. The spiritual hunger became a physical pain. I would stare at the stars over the Hindu Kush and whisper into the dark, "If you are there and you are more than just a judge, show me." I didn't realize that by asking that question, I was already signing my death warrant in the eyes of the Taliban. Doubt is the one thing a shadow cannot survive. My life was a series of rituals designed to mask the screaming silence of my heart. I climbed the ranks of the movement, not because I loved the cause, but because I was running away from the realization that I was utterly lost. I became the harshest judge because I hated the reflection of my own weakness in others. Every lash I ordered, every decree I signed, it was an attempt to prove to a silent heaven that I was worthy of a love I didn't believe existed. I lived in a world of blacks and whites, yet my soul was a swirling grey mist of confusion and longing. I looked at the mountains and saw not the glory of creation, but the jagged teeth of a world that wanted to consume me. I was a master of the law, yet the law was a heavy yoke that was slowly breaking my neck. I preached of a paradise I didn't truly want, and a hell I felt I was already living in. My zeal was a mask, a thick iron mask that hid the tears of a man who just wanted to be known, to be forgiven, and to be at rest. I was a commander of thousands, but I could not command a single moment of true peace within my own mind. The weight of my righteousness was far heavier than any sin I had ever committed, for it was a lie I told myself every single morning before the sun touched the peaks. I was a man trapped in a burning house, pretending the smoke was incense. The betrayal happened fast. A rival commander named Haibatullah, a man with a heart like a whetstone, wanted my territory. He told the council I had been seen talking to foreign agents. In our world, an accusation is a conviction. I was dragged from my bed in the middle of the night. My children watched in silence as their father, the lion, was tied like a goat and tossed into the back of a pickup truck. They didn't take me to a prison with windows. They took me to a subterranean cell, a literal hole in the earth beneath an old Soviet-era outpost. The torture was not just physical, it was psychological. They would leave me in total darkness for days. I lost track of time. The only way I knew I was still alive was the stinging of the salt they rubbed into the lash marks on my back. I felt a deep, biting sense of religious betrayal. I had given my life to this cause. I had sacrificed my humanity for this version of God, and this was my reward? To die in a hole, forgotten and disgraced. On what I think was the 7th night, I reached my breaking point. I started screaming. I cursed the darkness, I cursed Haibatullah, and I even cursed the day I was born. "Is this it?" I cried out. "Is this the end of the faithful?" Then the air in the cell changed. It didn't happen like a dream. It was more real than the stone walls. The freezing cold of the cell was suddenly replaced by a warmth that felt like a summer morning in a valley of lilies. A light began to manifest, not from a lamp, but from the center of the room. It was so bright I had to shield my eyes, yet it didn't burn. I saw a figure. He didn't look like an Afghan, nor did he look like a Westerner. He was simply light. He wore a white robe that seemed to be woven from stars. I fell on my face, certain that the angel of death had finally come for me. "Zabi," a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it shook the foundations of my soul. He spoke in my native Pashto, but the accent was pure, like a king speaking to a child. "Zabi, why do you persecute me?" I trembled, my face pressed into the filth of the floor. "Who are you, Lord?" I whispered. "I am the one you have been searching for in the dark," he replied. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. Your heart is hungry because you have been eating stones. Come to me, and I will give you living water." I felt a hand on my shoulder, a hand that felt like it was knitting my broken skin back together. Peace, thick and heavy like a blanket, fell over me. For the first time in 38 years, the void in my chest disappeared. I didn't see a ghost, I saw my Creator. When the light faded, the cell was still dark, but I was no longer in the dark. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that I had just met Isa, Jesus. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the stories I had heard of the prophet Isa with the divine presence that had just filled this wretched hole. I felt no more hunger for food, only a hunger to hear that voice again. The damp walls of my prison no longer felt like a grave. They felt like a womb where a new man was being formed. I realized that my captors could break my bones, but they could never touch the light that now lived inside me. I was a prisoner of the Taliban, but for the first time in my life, I was truly free. I spent the remaining hours of the night in a state of prayer that was more like a conversation than a ritual. I didn't need a prayer mat. I didn't need to face a certain direction. He was simply there. I felt the weight of my past crimes, the raids, the harsh judgments, the blood I had shed begin to melt away under the gaze of a love that saw everything and still chose me. The darkness of the Afghan night outside was nothing compared to the dawn that was breaking inside my spirit. I laughed softly in the dark, a sound that should have been impossible for a man facing execution. I realized that my life had been a long walk through a graveyard, and I had finally stepped into a garden. Every lash mark on my back seemed to pulse not with pain, but with the promise of a healing that was already begun. I was no longer a commander of men. I was a child of the living God, and that identity was worth more than all the valleys and mountains of my home. I understood that my suffering was not a punishment from a distant judge, but a path that led me to the feet of the only one who could truly see me. I lay my head on the cold stone floor and slept the sleep of the redeemed, knowing that whether I lived or died the next day, I was already home. The stars above the prison were just pinpricks in a veil. that had finally been torn open for me. I was ready for whatever the morning brought. The next morning, they came for me. They thought they were dragging a broken man to his death. They didn't know they were escorting a man who had already been set free. They marched me into the village square. A crowd had gathered. In our culture, an execution is a lesson. I saw people I had known for years. Some looked away in shame. Others spat at me. I was forced onto the wooden block. Any last words, Kafir? Hibatullah sneered, leaning close. He smelled of tobacco and malice. I looked him in the eye. I wasn't afraid. I have found the peace you will never know, I said quietly. He backhanded me across the face, but it felt like nothing. The executioner stepped up. He was a massive man, his face hidden by a black cloth. He raised the long, curved sword. I closed my eyes and whispered the name I had just learned, Isa. Suddenly, the wind roared, a freak sandstorm. A common in the desert but unheard of at this intensity in the mountains, slammed into the square. It was a wall of orange dust so thick you couldn't see your own hand. The crowd began to scream and scatter. I felt a strange sensation, a supernatural calm. Amidst the howling wind, I heard a heavy thud. I opened my eyes. The executioner was on the ground. He wasn't dead, but his body was twisting in a violent seizure, his hands locked like claws, the sword vibrating in the dust beside him. The guards were blinded by the sand, clutching their eyes. In the chaos, a hand grabbed my arm. I thought it was another guard, but the grip was different. It was firm, but kind. "Don't speak," a voice whispered in my ear. It was one of the younger guards, a man named Dawood, who had always been quiet. He quickly cut my ropes with a small knife. "You, go toward the northern ravine. There is a bike hidden under the brush." "Why are you doing this?" I hissed. He looked at me, and for a split second the dust cleared. He tapped his chest. "Because the man in white told me you were coming. Isa al-Masih is Lord." I was stunned. A secret believer? Here? In the heart of the Taliban? Dawood pushed me toward the edge of the square. "Go. Follow the star in your heart." I ran. I ran until my lungs burned like fire. I found the bike, and I rode into the teeth of the storm. As I moved, I felt a presence guiding me. I didn't have a map, but I had a star in my spirit. I was a dead man who had been given a second life. I wasn't just escaping an execution. I was escaping a grave I had lived in for nearly 4 decades. The wind lashed at my face, stinging my eyes with grit. Yet I felt an exhilaration I had never known in all my years of military victory. Each kilometer I put between myself and that village square felt like a layer of my old skin falling away. I was riding through a storm that should have killed me, yet it felt like the very breath of God was pushing me forward. The path was treacherous, winding through narrow mountain passes, where one wrong turn would mean a fall into the abyss. But I felt no fear. I was being carried by a hand I could not see toward a destination I did not yet know. I looked at my wrists, still red from the ropes, and saw them not as marks of shame, but as proof of my liberation. The desert was wide, and the mountains were high, but I felt larger than all of them because the Creator of the stars was walking with me. I realized that the sandstorm hadn't just saved my life. It had washed away the blood of my past. I was a new creation, riding into a new dawn. Every breath was a miracle, every heartbeat a prayer of gratitude. I didn't know where I would sleep or what I would eat, but for the first time in 38 years, I wasn't worried about the next hour. I was finally living in the light of the truth. The roar of the bike's engine was a song of freedom, echoing off the canyon walls like a shout of joy. I was no longer a commander of a dying cause. I was a fugitive of grace, and the journey had only just begun. I could feel the presence of the man in white beside me, even as the dust settled and the sun began to peek through the haze. He had called me by name in the dark, and now he was leading me through the light. The miracle wasn't just that I was alive. The miracle was that I wanted to live. I rode until the fuel ran out, then I walked. I found myself in a high-altitude village so remote it felt like the 14th century. I was exhausted, bleeding, and starving. An old man named Rahmat found me collapsed by a stream. He didn't ask who I was. He saw my tattered clothes and my wounds and took me into his stone hut. For 3 days he tended to me. He gave me goat's milk and bread. On the 4th day, I saw him sitting by the small fire, holding a book wrapped in a tattered blue cloth. "What is that?" I asked, my voice raspy. "Is it the Quran?" Rahmat smiled, a gentle expression I rarely saw in my old life. "It is the Injil," he said, "the good news of the Messiah." My heart hammered. "I met him," I whispered, "in the cell. He spoke to me." The old man's eyes lit up. He opened the book and began to read to me from the Gospel of Matthew. He read the Sermon on the Mount. "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." I started to weep. It was the complete opposite of everything I had been taught. My whole life had been built on an eye for an eye, on the sword for the infidel. But this was beautiful. It was the truth I had felt in the mother's cry years ago, but had been forced to suppress. I realized that my entire identity as a commander was built on sand. It was a house of cards that had rightfully collapsed. I spent weeks with Rahmat. We compared the laws I knew with the grace he showed me. I saw the contradictions in my old life, how we claimed to serve God while destroying his creation. So I realized that Jesus didn't come to start a new religion of rules. He came to bring us back to the Father. One evening, by the fire, I knelt down, not toward Mecca, but toward the presence I felt in the room. I confessed everything. I told him about the raids, the blood on my hands, the pride in my heart. I asked him to wash me. I officially surrendered my life to Christ. I felt the identity crisis resolve into a new peace. I was no longer Zabullah the commander. I was Zabullah, the Son of God. The words in that forbidden book felt like bread to a man who had been starving for decades. I devoured every page, every parable, every promise. I saw that the man in white wasn't just a vision, he was the Word made flesh. I realized that my power as a Taliban leader was actually weakness, and that true power was found in the humility of a cross. Rahmat told me that the Injil was a dangerous book in these mountains, but to me, it was the only thing that made sense of the madness I had lived through. I began to see the people of my country not as subjects to be ruled, but as sheep without a shepherd. My heart, which had been a stone for so long, began to beat with a strange, new compassion. I understood that the holy war I had fought was a war against the very image of God in man. I saw my own reflection in the stream and didn't recognize the eyes looking back. They were no longer full of the fire of judgment, but the clear light of hope. I was a fugitive, a traitor to my movement, and a target for any hunter. Yet I felt safer in that stone hut with a banned book than I ever had in my fortress with 1,000 soldiers. I was learning a new language, the language of grace, and it was rewriting the history of my soul. Every night we prayed together, Rahmat and I, two men from different worlds, united by the same Savior. I was no longer running from death, I was running toward life. The mountains didn't look like walls anymore. They looked like the majestic handiwork of a father who loved me. I was ready to leave the safety of the hut, not as a warrior, but as a witness. Grace changes your heart, but it doesn't always change your circumstances. My first thought as a new believer was of my family. I had to save them. I had to tell my wives and my sons that we had been wrong, that there was a better way. I traveled back in secret, moving only at night through the jagged shadows of the Hindu Kush. I reached my compound under the cover of a new moon, slipping past the guards I once trained. I managed to slip into the room of my eldest son, Ahmad. He was 19, a mirror image of the man I used to be, stern, devoted, and cold. "Father," he gasped, reaching for his rifle. "Peace, my son," I said, stepping into the dim light. "I am alive, and I have something to tell you." I told him everything. I told him about the vision in the cell, the seizure of the executioner, and the Injil I had discovered in the high mountains. I expected him to be happy his father was alive. I expected him to be curious about the power that had snatched me from the grave. Instead, his face contorted with a disgust I will never forget. "You are a murtad," he spat, the word for apostate hanging in the air like a curse. He didn't see his father. He saw a demon wearing his father's skin. My wives entered the room, having heard the urgent whispering. I looked at them, women I had shared a life with, provided for, and ruled over, and I saw a paralyzing terror. Not terror of me, but terror of what my conversion would do to their status in the village. "You have brought shame on us," my first wife shrieked, her voice a jagged blade. "The village says you are a traitor, and now you prove it by following the god of the foreigners." "It's not a foreign god," I pleaded, my heart breaking. "It's the truth that was here before the wars began." Then came the Judas kiss. Ahmad didn't attack me with his hands. He did something far worse. He walked to the open window and shouted for the village guards with a lung-bursting cry. "The apostate is here. The traitor has returned to pollute our home." The emotional blackmail was suffocating. My youngest son started crying in the corner, confused by the hatred in the room. My family began a ritualistic shaming. They literally turned their backs to me and began to wail as if I were a rotting corpse. They performed a funeral for me while I was still standing in the middle of the room, breathing and reaching out to them. "You are dead to us, Zabiullah," Ahmad said, his voice trembling with a dark, prideful righteousness. I had to flee as the rhythmic sound of boots approached the house from the main gate. I jumped from the back wall, leaving behind my wealth, my home, and the people I loved most in this world. I realized then that following Jesus doesn't just cost you your sins. Sometimes it costs you your entire world. I ran into the darkness, the tears streaming down my face, a feeling of loneliness that was deeper than any prison cell. I had offered them life, and they had chosen the honor of the grave. I was a man stripped of every earthly tie, a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. The Judas kiss from my own flesh and blood hurt more than the executioner's blade ever could have. Yet, even in that agonizing rejection, I felt a strange strength. I was walking the path that he had walked, rejected by his own, forsaken by his brothers. I wasn't just a convert, I was a participant in his sufferings. My family had buried me in their hearts, but God was raising me to a life they could not yet understand. I prayed for them as I disappeared into the night, asking that the same light that blinded me would one day open their eyes. I was truly a stranger in my own land now, a wanderer with nothing but a name and a faith. But as the lights of my home faded in the distance, I felt the man in white walking beside me once more. He had been rejected too, and in his company I was never truly alone. I was a ghost. I wandered through the border regions, hiding in the long shadows of the jagged peaks and sleeping in caves that smelled of damp earth and ancient dust. I was a man who had commanded thousands, now reduced to scrounging for scraps and jumping at the sound of every snapping twig. Eventually, through a series of coincidences that I now know were divine appointments orchestrated by a master hand, I found a contact for the underground church through a merchant in a crowded bazaar who noticed the peace in my eyes despite my rags. I met them in a basement of a nondescript house in a teeming city, and a place where the air was thick with the scent of tea and the whispered prayers of the brave. I was terrified. These were the very people I used to hunt, the ones I had labeled as vermin in my former life. Would they accept a man who had the blood of their brothers staining his hands? When I walked into that dimly lit room, there were about 12 people sitting in a circle. They looked at me with a caution that felt like a physical wall. Then a local pastor named Ishak stood up. He had deep scars on his forearms from his own time in a Taliban prison, scars I might have been responsible for. "I know who you are, Commander Zabiullah," he said, his voice steady and devoid of the malice I expected. I hung my head, the weight of my past pressing down on my shoulders like a mountain of lead. "I am not a commander," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I am a murderer who has been found by mercy." Ishaq didn't point a finger or call for justice. He did the unthinkable. He walked over and pulled me into a powerful embrace. I broke down. I sobbed like a helpless child into the shoulder of a man I would have arrested, or worse, 6 months prior. He taught me about spiritual family. He told me that in Christ there is no Taliban, no Westerner, no Afghan, only the new man washed in the blood of the Lamb. I stayed with them for months, hiding in plain sight. This was my inner healing phase, where the old Zabiullah was slowly dismantled and replaced. Ishaq walked me through the story of the prodigal son every night until it lived in my marrow. He helped me understand that while the world would never forgive my past crimes, God already had, casting them into a sea of forgetfulness. I moved from being a commander who gave orders with a bark to a servant who washed the grime from the floors and peeled potatoes for the widows in the group. It was the most dignified, holy work I had ever performed. We used encrypted apps to share fragments of scripture, and I watched with awe as the power of the gospel spread like a hidden, unquenchable fire through the dry brush of my country. I realized that the Taliban was merely a hollow shell of fear, but the church was a living, breathing body of indestructible hope. I began to prepare for the final part of my journey, crossing the border to a place where I could speak my truth loudly without a silencer. I learned that my strength didn't come from a rifle, but from the quiet whisper of the Spirit in the middle of the night. I was being forged into a different kind of soldier, one whose only weapon was a story of a man in white. I realized that my life was no longer my own. It had been bought at a price I could never repay, and every breath I took in that safe house was a gift from the Father of Lights. I looked at the believers around me and saw a beauty that eclipsed all the palaces I had once coveted. We were a stream running underground, hidden from the world, but bringing life to the desert. I was ready to flow wherever the current led me. Before I could cross the border into the unknown safety of a new land, the ghosts of my past finally caught up with me in a high, narrow mountain pass, where the wind howls like a wounded beast. I was intercepted at a jagged ridge by a patrol led by Omar, my former protege, a young man I had personally trained in the art of the ambush. He was a man I had molded in my own image, ruthless, aggressive, and desperate to prove his worth to a council of shadows. They surrounded me in a tight semicircle, 6 men with cold eyes and blackened AK-47s aimed at my chest. "I knew you were hiding in these hills, old man," Omar said, his voice trembling with a mixture of triumph and a strange buried grief. "The council wants your head on a spike at the city gates. They say you've become a Jesus slave, a traitor to the very soil that birthed you." I stood there in the center of their sights, completely unarmed and vulnerable, feeling the biting mountain air against my skin. In my old life, my mind would have been a machine of calculation, identifying the weak point in their line and visualizing how to disarm Omar and kill at least 3 of them before a single round could be fired. But that man, the commander of shadows, was dead and buried in the cell under the Soviet outpost. "I am a slave to no one, Omar," I said, my voice steady and low, carrying through the wind with a clarity that surprised even me. I have finally found the king who died for me, the only one who doesn't demand my blood because he already gave his own. Have you ever wondered why we were always so angry, my brother? Why do we always had to kill and destroy just to feel a fleeting moment of power? Shut up, he barked, his finger whitening against the trigger. His men looked nervous, their eyes darting between their former leader and the boy who now commanded them. Yeah, there was a different energy radiating from me now, not the suffocating heat of a controlled rage, but the deep, cool stillness of an eternal peace. You can kill me here on this rock, I said, taking a slow step forward until the cold, circular barrel of his rifle was pressed firmly against the center of my chest, right where the man in white had touched me. But you cannot kill the truth that has already set me free. I forgive you, Omar. I forgive you for what you are about to do, just as Isa forgave the men who nailed him to a wooden cross while they mocked his name. The air in the pass felt heavy, thick with a spiritual weight that seemed to press down on the very barrels of their guns. It was a battle of two worlds, plain and simple, the kingdom of the sword against the kingdom of the heart. I saw Omar's hand begin to shake violently, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The lion I had painstakingly trained was utterly terrified of the lamb I had become through grace. "He's cursed," one of the younger soldiers whispered, lowering his weapon in a daze. "Look at his eyes. There is a light in them that doesn't belong to this world." Omar roared in a sudden burst of helpless frustration, but he could not pull the trigger. The authority he thought he possessed was shattered by a love he couldn't comprehend or control. He lowered the gun, his shoulders slumping, and spat on the dusty ground between us. "Go," he hissed, his voice cracked and hollow. "If I ever see your face again, I will not hesitate to end you." I knew he was lying to himself to save face. I knew I had planted a seed of divine doubt in his heart that would grow into a forest he could never burn down. I turned my back to them and walked away into the mist. I didn't look back once. It wasn't a physical victory of arms, but it was a total, crushing defeat of the darkness that once ruled my every thought. I walked toward the border, no longer a fugitive, but a victor in a war that had already been won on a hill far away. I eventually crossed the border into a land where the air felt lighter, though my pockets were empty and my body was lean from months of flight. I had lost my country, my family, my rank, and every brick of the home I had built with blood and iron. But as I stand here today, looking into the lens of this camera, to share my soul with millions I will never meet, I realize I have never been more wealthy. When my testimony went viral across the Middle East and Central Asia, not because I am a gifted speaker, but because people cannot understand how a man of war becomes a man of peace without a single shot being fired. They want to know the secret of the commander who walked away from a throne of skulls. The secret is not a formula. The secret is a person. The secret is Jesus Christ, the man in white who met me in a hole in the earth when I was at my absolute lowest. I am a man without a physical country now, a wanderer in the eyes of the world, but I am a high citizen of a kingdom that will never end and a home that can never be bombed or betrayed. I spend my days now reaching out through the digital waves to other commanders, other Ahmads, and other Omars who are still trapped in the iron cage of zealotry. I tell them that the burden of the law is a crushing weight that no man can carry, but the yoke of Christ is easy and his burden is light. I still have nightmares sometimes, the smell of cordite and the sound of weeping. But then I remember the touch on my shoulder in that dark cell. I remember the words of Philippians 4:7. "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." I never found that peace in a jihad, and I never found it in the cold repetition of a ritual. I found it at the foot of the cross, in the middle of a jagged desert, when I finally stopped fighting and started following. If you are watching this right now and you feel the suffocating weight of your past, if you feel like you're sitting in a cell of your own making, waiting for an executioner that never sleeps, look up. The light is already there, shining in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. You do not have to earn this love. You do not have to kill for this glory. You do not have to fight for a seat at this table. You just have to surrender your sword and take his hand. My name is Zabula Mansour. I was once a commander of shadows, leading men into a night without end. Now, by the grace of the living God, I am a messenger of the light, leading captives into a day that never sets. I have seen the miracle in Afghanistan, and I know that if Jesus could save a man like me, the chief of sinners, from the mountains of the Hindu Kush, he can certainly reach out and save you exactly where you are sitting today. The storm has passed, the sun has risen, and the man in white is calling your name just as he called mine. Thank you for listening to my story. My prayer is that my ending becomes your beginning. God bless you, and may you find the peace that only the Prince of Peace can give. I am no longer a man of the sword. I am a man of the word, and that is a victory that will last forever.